It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, a 9-year-old girl walking home after a day of school, excited to share her achievements with her father. But in a matter of moments, her world was turned upside down. A friendly officer offered her a ride home, his uniform a symbol of trust and safety. Yet, what followed was a chilling betrayal that would change her life forever. As darkness fell and the streets grew quieter, a once safe neighborhood became the backdrop for a harrowing ordeal. The officer's warm smile faded, replaced by a sinister agenda. Trapped and terrified, the young girl had no idea that her father, a man devoted to protecting others, was racing against time to save her. Would he arrive in time, or would the very system he trusted fail him when it mattered most? Before we dive into this gripping story of trust, betrayal, and courage, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you're as captivated by this story as we are, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more powerful narratives like this. 9-year-old Layla Bennett adjusted the straps of her bright yellow backpack as she strolled through her quiet neighborhood. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and a cool breeze carried the rustle of leaves through the air. It was the end of another ordinary school day, and Layla couldn't wait to share her achievements with her dad. Earlier that day, she had aced her spelling test, and her art teacher had singled out her drawing for a special mention in class. Layla's heart brimmed with excitement as she thought about how proud her father, Officer Malcolm Bennett, would be. A dedicated police lieutenant, he was her hero, and a figure of unwavering kindness and protection in her life. As Layla walked along the familiar route home, she felt a deep sense of security. Her dad had always told her, "Police officers are here to protect us, sweetheart. If you're ever in trouble, don't hesitate to trust them." That belief had been instilled in her since she was little, and it filled her with an innocent confidence. But as the shadows grew longer and the streets became quieter, Layla began to feel a strange unease. She wasn't sure why. Everything around her looked the same row of houses, the same street lamps flickering to life, but something about the atmosphere made her clutch her backpack tighter. Turning a corner, she suddenly heard the low hum of an approaching car. A black and white patrol vehicle slowed as it came alongside her, its headlights cutting through the dim light. Layla glanced over her curiosity peak and saw the passenger side window rolling down. "Hello there, young lady," said a man in a police uniform, leaning slightly out of the window. His smile was wide and his voice sounded friendly. "It's getting pretty late. Where are you headed?" Layla stopped in her tracks, shifting her weight nervously. "Home," she replied cautiously. "It's just a few blocks away." The officer nodded, his smile never wavering. "That's good, but it's not safe for a young girl to be walking alone this late. How about I give you a ride? I can get you home safely." Layla hesitated. Her dad's words echoed in her mind. Don't talk to strangers. But was this man really a stranger? He was a police officer, like her father. Surely she could trust him. Right? The sky had darkened considerably now, and the street ahead seemed emptier than usual. Weighing her options, Layla finally nodded. "Okay," she said softly. The officer opened the car door, and Layla climbed into the back seat. She buckled her seatbelt, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to ignore the faint metallic smell inside the car. The man looked at her through the rearview mirror, his smile warm. "What's your name?" he asked. "Layla," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Layla," the officer repeated as if savoring the sound of her name. "That's a beautiful name. My name's Officer Richards. Don't worry, you're in good hands." At first, everything seemed normal. Layla watched the houses and streetlights pass by through the window, but soon her smile began to fade. Something wasn't right. Sir?" she said hesitantly. "My house is the other way." The officer glanced at her in the mirror, his friendly expression hardening for just a moment before softening again. "I just need to make a quick stop first," he said. "Don't worry about it." Layla's unease deepened, but she stayed silent. Her dad's voice echoed in her head again. "Always trust your instincts." Her instincts now screamed that something was wrong. The patrol car veered off the main road and onto a narrower, less familiar street. The surroundings became more desolate, with overgrown bushes and sparse streetlights casting eerie shadows. Layla gripped her backpack tightly, her knuckles turning white. Finally, the car came to a stop in a small clearing surrounded by trees. Officer Richards turned off the engine and unbuckled his seatbelt. "Stay here." "I'll be right back," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth it had held earlier. Before she could respond, he exited the car and locked the doors behind him. Layla's heart raced as she watched him disappear into the shadows. She reached for her phone in her backpack, but when she pressed the power button, the screen remained black. Her phone was dead. Her father had reminded her that morning to charge it, but she'd been so excited to show him her spelling test that she had forgotten. Now trapped in the dimly lit car, she felt utterly alone. Minutes ticked by like hours. The once friendly shadows of the trees now seemed menacing, their long, twisted branches clawing at the car windows. Layla's breath came in shallow gasps as her panic mounted. The sound of footsteps approaching jolted her back to reality. Officer Richards returned, carrying a small bag in one hand. He climbed back into the car without a word, his movements sharp and deliberate. Layla mustered her courage. "Are we going to my house now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Richards didn't answer immediately. Instead, he started the engine, his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed straight ahead. "We'll get there," he muttered, his tone cold. The car jerked forward, bumping along the uneven dirt path. Layla clutched her backpack like a lifeline, fear clawing at her chest. For the first time in her life, she doubted her father's words. The patrol car bounced along the uneven dirt road, its headlights barely illuminating the twisted, overgrown trees lining the path. Layla's knuckles were white as she clutched her backpack tightly against her chest. The air inside the car felt heavy and suffocating, and the officer's silence only heightened her unease. She dared to glance at Officer Richards in the rearview mirror. His face was hard, his jaw clenched tightly as though he were suppressing some inner conflict. The friendly demeanor he'd shown earlier had completely vanished. "Where are we going?" Layla asked again, her voice small but insistent. "Bookmark?" The officer's eyes flicked toward her reflection in the mirror, and for a brief moment something sinister flashed in his gaze. "Didn't I tell you to sit back and be quiet?" he snapped, his tone sharp and commanding. Layla flinched as though struck. She sank deeper into her seat, her heart pounding in her chest. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying would only make things worse. She thought of her father, Officer Malcolm Bennett, and the pride she'd always felt knowing he was a police officer. He had taught her to believe that people in uniform were protectors and defenders of justice. But this man sitting in the front seat didn't feel like a protector. Her father's words echoed in her mind, firm but loving. "Layla, always trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't." Layla clenched her fists, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She needed to think. Her phone was dead, and the area they were in was completely isolated. The road they were on looked like it hadn't been used in years, with weeds growing through the cracks and branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The car jolted to a sudden stop, and Layla's stomach flipped. Richards threw the car into the park and turned off the engine. The abrupt silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. "Get out," he ordered, his voice cold and devoid of patience. Layla stared at him, frozen in place. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard sighed heavily, his frustration evident. He turned to face her, his expression dark and threatening. "I said get out," he repeated, his voice rising. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the seatbelt. Her legs felt like jelly as she climbed out of the car, clutching her backpack like a shield. The cool night air hit her face, but it did little to clear the fog of fear clouding her mind. Richards towered over her, his imposing figure casting a long shadow in the dim moonlight. He pointed to a spot near the edge of the clearing. "Stand there," he commanded. Layla obeyed, her small frame trembling. She felt like prey under the gaze of a predator, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. But where would she go? She didn't know the way back to the main road, and even if she did, she doubted she could outrun him. Her thoughts were interrupted when Richard stepped closer, leaning down so that his face was just inches from hers. She could smell the faint scent of cigarettes on his breath, and it made her stomach churn. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Walking around like you own the place, like the world owes you something. You don't know anything about how things really work. I didn't do anything wrong, Layla whispered, her voice quivering. Richards laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent shivers down her spine. Wrong? He echoed mockingly. You don't have to do anything wrong. People like you just irritate me. Layla's chest tightened, and her breathing became shallow. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but the malice in his voice was unmistakable. She wanted to scream, to cry for help, but her throat felt like it was closing up. Richard suddenly grabbed the straps of her backpack and yanked it off her shoulders. Layla let out a startled cry, but he ignored her protests, tossing the bag into the car. "Get back in," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. "No, please," Layla whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "I want to go home." Richards's face twisted with anger. He grabbed her arm roughly and shoved her toward the open car door. Layla stumbled, barely managing to catch herself before falling. "Get in," he growled, his voice low and menacing. Her legs felt like they would collapse beneath her, but somehow she found the strength to climb back into the car. She pressed herself against the door, as far away from him as possible, her entire body trembling. As Richard slammed the door shut and got into the driver's seat, Layla silently prayed for a miracle. She thought of her father, the tracking app he had installed on her phone as a precaution. "Please, Daddy," she whispered under her breath. "Find me." Miles away, Officer Malcolm Bennett sat at the kitchen table, finishing his dinner, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, expecting a message from work, but what he saw made his heart stop. It was the tracker app. Layla's location was nowhere near their home. Instead, it showed her in an unfamiliar area on the outskirts of town. His mind raced as dread coiled tightly around his chest. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Grabbing his keys, Malcolm bolted out the door. His heart pounded in his chest as he jumped into his car, the tracker glowing on his dashboard. "Hang on, Layla," he muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I'm coming." The silence in Officer Malcolm Bennett's car was oppressive, broken only by the sound of his breathing and the low hum of the engine. His eyes darted between the dark road ahead and the glowing dot on his phone's tracker app. Layla's location hadn't moved in the past few minutes, but that only heightened his sense of urgency. "Please, let her be safe," he muttered, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. Bookmark. The road ahead was empty, the streetlights growing sparse as he neared the edge of town. The once familiar streets gave way to overgrown bushes and broken asphalt, and Malcolm's dread deepened. He pushed the accelerator harder, his patrol car roaring forward into the night. Back in the clearing, Layla sat in the back seat of Officer Richards's car, her small frame trembling with fear. She clutched her knees to her chest, pressing herself as far into the corner as the confined space would allow. Richard sat silently in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He seemed to be deliberating something, his jaw working as though grinding his teeth. Every now and then he glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his cold, predatory gaze sending chills down her spine. "Why are we here?" Layla finally asked, her voice trembling. Richards exhaled sharply, as if irritated by her question. "You just don't know when to shut up, do you?" he snapped, his voice laced with anger. Layla flinched, tears pricking at her eyes. She shrank further into the seat, wishing she could disappear. Richards leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Kids these days," he muttered under his breath. "Think you can talk back to anyone, question authority. Someone needs to teach you a lesson." Layla's heart raced, her fear mounting with every word. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just want to go home." Richards turned to face her, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Home?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you deserve to just walk away from this?" Layla's breath hitched as Richards reached across the seat, his hand gripping her arm tightly. Pain shot through her shoulder, and she let out a small cry. "I said, do you understand me?" he growled, shaking her slightly. "Yes," Layla sobbed, her voice desperate. "I understand." Richards released her arm, and she cradled it protectively, her skin already beginning to bruise. She could feel the tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't dare wipe them away. Every movement seemed to provoke him, and she couldn't risk making him angrier. In the oppressive darkness, The sound of gravel crunching under trees suddenly broke the stillness. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as they approached. Richards froze, his hand retracting as he turned toward the source of the light. Layla's heart leaped with a mix of fear and hope. Could it be her father? The headlights belonged to a police car, but the figure stepping out of it was no ordinary officer. Malcolm Bennett's tall, powerful frame was silhouetted against the glow of his car's high beams as he marched toward Richards' vehicle. His face was etched with fury, his every movement radiating purpose. "Layla," he called, his voice strong and commanding. "Dad," Layla cried, her voice raw with relief. She scrambled toward the window, pressing her hands against the glass as if trying to reach him. Richards cursed under his breath, fumbling for the keys to unlock the car. As he stepped out, he raised his hands in a feigned gesture of innocence. "Lieutenant Bennett," he began, his voice dripping with false politeness. "This isn't what it looks like." But Malcolm didn't let him finish. He crossed the distance between them in a heartbeat, his fist connecting with Richards's jaw with a force that sent the man sprawling to the ground. Richards groaned, clutching his face as Malcolm loomed over him, his chest heaving with fury. "You dared to lay a hand on my daughter?" Malcolm growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I don't know what you were planning?" Richards tried to crawl away, but Malcolm grabbed him by the collar, hauling him to his feet. "You're done," Malcolm said coldly, his grip like steel. "You'll never wear that badge again." The sound of sirens filled the air, and backup finally arrived. Malcolm released Richards and rushed to the car. He threw open the back door and pulled Layla into his arms. She clung to him, her small frame trembling as sobs racked her body. "You're safe now," Malcolm murmured, holding her tightly. "I've got you. I'll never let anyone hurt you again." Layla buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking into his uniform. For the first time that night, she felt a flicker of safety. The nightmare was over. As the other officers arrived, they hesitated, unsure of what to make of the scene before them. Malcolm's booming voice left no room for argument as he barked orders. "Cuff him," he shouted, pointing at Richards. "Now!" The officers exchanged uneasy glances before finally moving toward Richards, who staggered to his feet, his face a mix of fear and indignation. "This is a misunderstanding," Richards protested, his voice shaky. "I was just trying to help the girl." "Shut your mouth," Malcolm roared, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get to make excuses for what you've done." As the officers cuffed Richards and led him to the back of a patrol car, Malcolm turned his attention back to Layla. Her tear-streaked face was buried in his chest, her hands clutching his uniform as though letting go would mean losing him. "It's over, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice soft but resolute. "You're safe now." As the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the clearing, the reality of what had just happened began to set in for everyone present. Officer Richards sat in the back of a patrol car, his wrists cuffed tightly behind him, his face bruised and twisted in a mix of defiance and fear. He shifted uncomfortably, occasionally glancing at the officers outside, but finding no sympathetic eyes among them. Meanwhile, Malcolm Bennett held his daughter close, his large hands cradling her trembling frame as if shielding her from the world. Layla's sobs had quieted, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Malcolm's jaw clenched as he brushed a stray tear from her cheek, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You're okay now, Layla," he murmured softly. "Nobody's going to hurt you, I promise." Nearby, the other officers stood frozen, unsure of how to handle the situation. Malcolm, their respected lieutenant, had just apprehended one of their own, and the weight of that fact hung heavily in the air. Finally, one of the younger officers stepped forward cautiously. "Lieutenant Bennett," he said, his voice hesitant. What exactly happened here?" Malcolm turned to face him, his expression hard and unyielding. "What happened," he said, his voice low and steady, "is that this man," he gestured sharply toward Richards, "abducted my daughter and threatened her." The younger officer paled, his eyes darting to the patrol car where Richards sat. "Are you sure, sir? I mean, this is a serious accusation. Do I look unsure to you?" Malcolm barked, his tone cutting through the officer's doubt like a knife. "He took her. He hurt her. And if it were up to me, he'd never see the light of day again." The young officer took a step back, his face pale. "Yes, sir," he stammered, nodding quickly. Malcolm exhaled heavily, trying to calm himself. He couldn't afford to let his anger take control. Not now. His priority was Layla. He looked down at her, still clutching his uniform tightly, and his expression softened. "Baby, did he hurt you?" he asked gently, his voice almost breaking. Layla nodded slowly, her eyes red and swollen. "He grabbed my arm really hard," she whispered, her voice trembling. And he said scary things. Malcolm's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to keep his voice calm. "It's over now," he assured her. "He's not going to hurt you or anyone else ever again." As Malcolm carried Layla to his car, his mind raced. The situation was far from resolved. The weight of what had happened and what it meant pressed down on him like a physical burden. He gently placed Layla in the passenger seat and buckled her in, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the straps. "We're going home," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "You don't need to see any more of this." Layla didn't respond. She simply leaned against the seat, her small body trembling as she stared out the window. Malcolm climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the low rumble breaking the tense silence. As he pulled away from the clearing, the flashing lights of the patrol cars grew smaller in the rearview mirror. But the night's events replayed in his mind with startling clarity. Back in the clearing, Richards was still protesting as the officers prepared to transport him to the station. "I didn't do anything wrong," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "This is all a misunderstanding. She's lying." One of the senior officers, Sergeant Williams, stepped forward, his face etched with disapproval. "You're done, Richards," he said firmly. "I don't know what you were thinking, but this isn't going to go away." Richards scoffed, his bravado flickering. "You don't know the full story. This is all Bennett blowing things out of proportion. Save it for your lawyer," Williams snapped, cutting him off. "You've crossed a line, and you're going to answer for it." The patrol car door slammed shut, silencing Richards's protests. Meanwhile, at the Bennett home, Layla sat curled up on the living room couch, wrapped in a soft blanket. Malcolm knelt in front of her, his large hands gently brushing the hair from her tear-streaked face. "I'm going to call a doctor to check you out, okay?" he said softly. "Just to make sure you're all right." Layla nodded numbly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Will you stay with me?" she asked, her voice small and fragile. Malcolm's heart broke at her words. He reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Always," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The hours that followed were a blur. Malcolm stayed by Layla's side as the doctor examined her, checking for bruises and signs of trauma. Layla winced as the doctor gently pressed on her arm where Richards had grabbed her, the skin already beginning to bruise. "You'll be okay," the doctor said kindly, offering her a small smile. "You're a very brave girl." Layla didn't respond. She simply clutched her blanket tighter, her mind still reeling from the night's events. Malcolm walked the doctor to the door, his expression somber. "Thank you for coming," he said. The doctor nodded. "She's lucky you found her when you did," he said. "If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to call." After the doctor left, Malcolm returned to the living room and sat beside Layla. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did he do that? Why did he hate me?" Malcolm felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I don't know, sweetheart," he admitted. "Some people are just broken, but what he did has nothing to do with you. You didn't deserve any of it." Layla looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Will he go to jail?" "Yes," Malcolm said firmly. "And I'm going to make sure he can't hurt anyone else ever again." As he held his daughter close, Malcolm knew the road ahead would be difficult. The system that had allowed Richards to abuse his power would need to be confronted, and the battle for justice was just beginning. The next morning, Malcolm Bennett sat in his office at the precinct, his head buried in his hands. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a haunting reel. Each time he thought about the terror in Layla's eyes, his chest tightened with guilt. He had spent his entire career enforcing the law and protecting his community. Yet someone from his own ranks, a man he had trusted, had violated the very values he had sworn to uphold. The precinct was unusually quiet, but Malcolm could feel the weight of the officers' stares as they passed his door. They weren't used to seeing their lieutenant in such a vulnerable state. The news of Officer Richards's arrest had already spread, and the shockwaves were palpable. A knock at the door broke his train of thought. "Come in," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "Bookmark, go back." Detective Rivera, one of Malcolm's most trusted colleagues, entered, carrying a thin folder. Her usually confident demeanor was tempered with unease. "Lieutenant, I've got preliminary incident report," she said, placing the folder on his desk. Malcolm opened it, his eyes scanning the details. The words blurred together as he read about Richards's actions, his false pretense of offering Layla a ride, the detour to the isolated clearing, and the physical harm he had inflicted. Seeing it written in black and white only deepened Malcolm's anger and resolve. "This isn't just about my daughter," Malcolm said, his voice low but firm. "Richards abused his badge, his power. He's a disgrace to this department, and to every officer who takes their oath seriously." Rivera nodded. "You're right," she said, "but you know how these things go. Richards is already claiming it was a misunderstanding. His lawyer is pushing the angle that you acted emotionally because it was your daughter." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Emotional?" he said, his voice rising. "He abducted my 9-year-old girl, Rivera. This wasn't some misunderstanding. This was calculated, deliberate." Rivera hesitated. "I don't disagree, sir, but we need to be prepared. Cases like this don't always play out the way they should." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders unrelenting. He knew Rivera was right. The justice system wasn't always straightforward, especially when it involved one of their own. "I'll deal with it," Malcolm said finally, his voice resolute. "Richards isn't walking away from this." At home, Layla sat in the living room, her knees pulled to her chest as she stared out the window. The sunlight streaming in did little to chase away the lingering shadows in her mind. Her favorite stuffed animal, a small brown bear her father had given her on her 5th birthday, sat in her lap. She held it tightly, finding solace in its soft texture. Her mother, Evelyn Bennett, had flown in from a business trip the moment she heard the news. She sat beside Layla now, her arm draped protectively over her daughter's shoulders. "Sweetheart, are you feeling okay?" Evelyn asked gently. Layla shrugged, her gaze distant. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's like, I'm home, but I still feel scared." Evelyn's heart ached for her daughter. She brushed a strand of Layla's hair back and kissed the top of her head. "It's okay to feel scared, honey," she said. "What happened to you was awful, and it's going to take time to feel safe again. But you're so brave, and your dad and I are here for you, always." Layla nodded slowly but didn't say anything. Back at the precinct, Malcolm prepared for a press conference. The public needed answers, and he knew staying silent would only fuel speculation. As he stood at the podium, the glare of camera lights and the cacophony of reporters' questions threatened to overwhelm him, but he maintained his composure. "I want to start by saying that what happened to my daughter, Layla, was a tragedy that never should have occurred," Malcolm began, his voice steady despite the emotions simmering beneath the surface. "As a father, I am devastated. As a police officer, I am outraged." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Officer Richards's actions were not only a violation of the law, but a betrayal of the trust this community has placed in its law enforcement. Let me be clear. There will be no cover-ups, no excuses. Justice will be served. Questions erupted from the reporters, but Malcolm raised a hand to quiet them. "I can't comment on the specifics of the ongoing investigation," he said. "However, I can assure you that this department will cooperate fully with internal affairs and the justice system. We owe it to the people we serve to hold ourselves to the highest standard." As the press conference concluded, Malcolm returned to his office, exhaustion etched into his features. He knew the battle was far from over. Richards's trial would be grueling, and Malcolm was prepared for every tactic the defense would use to discredit him and his family. Meanwhile, the arrest of Officer Richards sent shockwaves through the community. Protests erupted outside the precinct, with citizens demanding accountability and systemic reform. Signs reading "Justice for Layla" and "Hold cops accountable" were held high as chants echoed through the streets. Inside, Malcolm watched the scene unfold through his office window. The sight of the community rallying around his daughter brought a glimmer of hope, but it was bittersweet. "This isn't just about Layla," he thought. "This is about every person who's been failed by the badge." That night, Malcolm sat with Layla in her room as she prepared for bed. She clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her small frame curled beneath the covers. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "Yes, baby girl?" Malcolm replied, his voice gentle. "Do you think he's sorry for what he did?" she asked, her eyes wide and searching. Malcolm paused, the question catching him off guard. "I don't know, Layla," he admitted, "but what I do know is that what he did was wrong, and he's going to face the consequences for it." Layla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I hope he is," she said quietly, "because if he isn't, then maybe he'll do it to someone else." Malcolm's heart clenched at her words, but he forced himself to smile. "That's why we're going to make sure he doesn't," he said firmly. As he kissed her forehead and turned off the light, Malcolm knew that his fight for justice was about more than his daughter. It was about ensuring that no child or anyone would ever have to experience what Layla had endured. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Officer Richards' trial. The gallery buzzed with murmured conversations as reporters, activists, and concerned citizens filled every available seat. Outside, protesters held signs demanding accountability, their chants carrying into the halls. Malcolm Bennett sat in the front row, his large frame tense and imposing. He kept a protective arm around Layla, who sat beside him in a modest navy dress, her hair neatly braided. Her small hands gripped the edge of her chair as her eyes darted nervously around the room. Despite Malcolm's attempts to reassure her, she was visibly shaken. "It's going to be okay, baby," Malcolm whispered, leaning close. "Just remember, you're not alone. I'm here." Bookmark. Layla nodded faintly, her gaze fixed on the defendant's table where Richards sat flanked by his legal team. The man who had once exuded arrogant confidence now appeared subdued, his demeanor carefully crafted by his lawyers to project humility. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The judge entered, her stern expression silencing the room. As everyone took their seats, the trial began with the prosecution's opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," began Sarah Whitman, a sharp and determined prosecutor with a reputation for being relentless in the pursuit of justice. "We are here today because a man entrusted with protecting our community chose instead to violate that trust in the most heinous way imaginable. Officer Richards did not just fail to uphold his duty, he weaponized his authority against an innocent child, inflicting trauma no child should ever endure." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. "This case is not just about Officer Richards' actions," Whitman continued. "It is about holding accountable those who abuse the power granted to them by the badge. It is about ensuring that no family, no child, will have to face the fear and pain that Layla Bennett endured that night." The jury listened intently, their expressions somber. When it was the defense's turn, Richards' attorney, Mark Grayson, stood and approached the jury with a measured tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "while the events described by the prosecution are undeniably troubling, we must remember that the accused is innocent until proven guilty. Officer Richards has served this community honorably for years, and we believe the evidence will show that this situation was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by highly emotional circumstances." Malcolm's jaw tightened as he listened, his fists clenching at his sides. He glanced down at Layla, who was staring straight ahead, her face pale. The first witnesses called to the stand were the officers who had arrived at the scene that night. They described finding Layla in the back of Richards's patrol car, visibly shaken and crying, and recounted Malcolm's confrontation with Richards. The prosecution's questions were direct and unyielding, painting a clear picture of the fear and harm Layla had experienced. When Malcolm took the stand, the courtroom held its collective breath. Dressed in his crisp uniform, he walked with purpose, his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. After being sworn in, he began recounting the events of that night, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "The moment I saw her location on the tracker, I knew something was wrong," Malcolm said, his eyes fixed on the jury. "Layla should have been home, but instead, she was in the middle of nowhere, with someone I thought I could trust. Someone who had sworn to protect people, abusing that trust in the worst possible way." Whitman guided him through the testimony, carefully emphasizing Richards's actions and the immediate danger Layla had been in. When it was time for the defense's cross-examination, Grayson approached the stand with calculated confidence. "Lieutenant Bennett," he began, "is it fair to say that your actions that night were driven more by emotion than by reason?" Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "My actions were driven by a need to protect my daughter," he replied firmly. Grayson smiled faintly, as if expecting the answer. "And yet, you physically attacked Officer Richards before any investigation could take place. Is that standard procedure for a law enforcement officer?" Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice low and resolute. "I did what any parent would do to protect their child," he said. "If you want to call that an attack, then so be it. But nothing changes the fact that Richards is guilty of what he did." The tension in the room was palpable as Grayson returned to his seat, his smug expression faltering under Malcolm's unwavering stare. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Layla took the stand. Malcolm had been reluctant to let her testify, worried about the toll it would take on her, but Layla had insisted. "I want them to hear what he did," she had told him, her voice trembling but determined. As the bailiff led her to the stand, Layla looked impossibly small against the imposing backdrop of the courtroom. After being sworn in, she glanced nervously at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Layla," Whitman began gently, "can you tell us what happened the night Officer Richards offered you a ride?" Layla hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the stand. "He said he wanted to help me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But then, he started saying mean things. He got really angry. He grabbed my arm, and it hurt. I was so scared." Her voice broke and tears welled up in her eyes. Malcolm shifted in his seat, his fists clenched as he fought the urge to rush to her side. "You're doing great, Layla," Whitman said softly. "Take your time." Layla wiped her eyes and continued. "He told me no one would come for me, that no one cared. But my daddy came. He saved me." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the raw emotion in her voice striking a chord with everyone present. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order, but the impact of Layla's words lingered. Grayson's cross-examination was brief. His attempts to discredit Layla's testimony were met with thinly veiled hostility from the jury. Her innocence and vulnerability made it nearly impossible for anyone to doubt her. As Malcolm and Layla left the courtroom that day, the weight of her testimony seemed to hang in the air. Malcolm knelt down and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You were so brave," he said, his voice filled with pride. Layla looked at him with wide, tearful eyes. "Did I help, Daddy?" she asked. Malcolm nodded firmly. "You did more than help," he said. "You made sure everyone knows the truth." As he hugged her tightly, Malcolm felt a renewed determination. The fight for justice was far from over, but he knew they were one step closer to holding Richards accountable. The trial resumed the following morning with an atmosphere of tension that weighed heavily on everyone present. The prosecution had built a solid case, bolstered by Layla's emotional testimony, Malcolm's compelling account, and the reports from the officers who had witnessed Richards' arrest. However, the defense wasn't going down without a fight. Mark Grayson, Richards' attorney, began the day with a new angle. Armed with a smug confidence, he called his first witness, a fellow officer who had worked with Richards for years. "Officer Carter," Grayson began, pacing in front of the jury. "How long have you known the defendant?" Carter cleared his throat, sitting stiffly in the witness chair. "About 5 years," he said. "And in those 5 years, have you ever seen Officer Richards behave in a way that might suggest he would harm a child?" Grayson asked, his voice dripping with insinuation. Carter hesitated. "No," he said finally. "Richards has always been professional on duty." Grayson nodded, turning to the jury. "Professional," he repeated. "A trusted officer, someone who served his community without incident for years." "Thank you, Officer Carter." As Carter stepped down, Malcolm felt a flicker of frustration. He knew what the defense was trying to do: paint Richards as a model officer whose actions were being misrepresented. The prosecution quickly countered by calling their own witness, a man who lived near the clearing where Richards had taken Layla. The witness, a middle-aged hunter named Doug, adjusted his plaid shirt nervously as he took the stand. "Mr. Reynolds," Sarah Whitman began, "can you tell us what you were doing the night of the incident?" "I was out in the woods checking traps," Doug said. I heard a car on the old dirt road, which is unusual for that area, so I got curious and went to take a look. What did you see? Whitman prompted. I saw a patrol car parked in the clearing, Doug said. At first I thought maybe it was an officer on duty, but then I heard noises. A girl is crying. It didn't sound right. Doug paused, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. I recorded what I heard on my phone, just in case. I didn't know what was going on, but it didn't feel right. Whitman's eyes lit up. You recorded it? Yes, Doug said, pulling a USB drive from his pocket. I brought it with me. The judge allowed the audio to be played, and the courtroom fell silent as the recording filled the space. Layla's voice could be heard, trembling and tearful. Please, I just want to go home. Richards's response was cold and biting. No one's coming for you. Do as you're told. The room was gripped by a collective tension as the recording continued, capturing the unmistakable sound of Layla's muffled sobs. When the audio ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the defense seemed shaken, their carefully constructed narrative cracking under the weight of the evidence. Whitman turned back to the jury. This, she said, her voice firm, is what Layla Bennett endured. Not just fear, but the calculated cruelty of someone who was supposed to protect her. As the trial progressed, the defense grew increasingly desperate. Grayson called Richards to the stand in a last-ditch effort to sway the jury. Richards adjusted his tie as he took his seat, his face carefully composed. He looked out at the jury, his expression a mixture of contrition and defiance. Officer Richards, Grayson began, can you explain your actions the night of the incident? Richards nodded. Of course, he said, his voice calm. When I saw Layla walking alone, I thought it was unsafe for her to be out that late. I offered her a ride to make sure she got home safely. And why did you deviate from the route to her home? Grayson asked. Richards hesitated, his brow furrowing. I got turned around, he said finally. It wasn't intentional. And when we stopped in the clearing, it was because I needed to take a moment to figure out the right route. Grayson nodded, turning to the jury. Does this sound like the actions of a man with malicious intent? Or does it sound like an unfortunate series of missteps? Malcolm's fists clenched as he listened. He could feel Layla tense beside him, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress. Whitman rose for the cross-examination, her expression steely. Officer Richards, she began, if your only concern was Layla's safety, why did you fail to inform her father of her location? Surely you knew he'd be worried. Richards shifted uncomfortably. I didn't think it was necessary, he said. You didn't think it was necessary, Whitman repeated, her voice sharp. Even though you took her miles from her intended destination? Richards opened his mouth to respond, but Whitman didn't give him the chance. And why, she continued, did you lock the car doors, prevent Layla from leaving, and speak to her in a threatening manner? Is that standard procedure for ensuring a child's safety? Richards' composure began to crumble under the weight of her questions. I didn't mean to frighten her, he stammered. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Officer Richards? Whitman pressed, her tone cutting. Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you abused your authority to terrify a child for reasons only you can explain. Richards' face paled, his carefully crafted image shattering. By the end of the day, the prosecution had presented a damning case. Between Layla's testimony, the recording, and Richards's faltering defense, it was clear that the jury was leaning heavily toward conviction. As Malcolm and Layla left the courtroom, the weight of the trial seemed to ease just slightly. Malcolm knelt down beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You did amazing today, he said, his voice filled with pride. Layla looked up at him, her expression tired but determined. Do you think they believe me? She asked. Malcolm nodded. I think they do, he said, and I think they're starting to see Richards for who he really is. For the first time in days, Layla managed a small smile. As they walked toward the car, Malcolm felt a renewed sense of determination. The fight wasn't over, but the truth was on their side. The courtroom was tense as the prosecution prepared to deliver its final piece of evidence. The jury had heard Layla's emotional testimony, Malcolm's steadfast account, and even the chilling recording from the woods. But now Whitman had a surprise witness, a final blow to dismantle Richards's defense once and for all. Your Honor, Whitman said, rising confidently from her seat. The prosecution calls Detective Clara Rivera to the stand. Bookmark. Go back. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Malcolm's eyes widened slightly as Rivera stood and walked to the front of the courtroom. She had worked alongside Richards for years and had a reputation as a no-nonsense investigator. Her testimony could change everything. After being sworn in, Rivera sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her sharp gaze cutting through the tension in the room. "Detective Rivera," Whitman began, "how long have you been a part of this precinct?" 15 years, Rivera replied evenly. "And in those years, have you had the opportunity to work closely with Officer Richards?" "Yes," Rivera said. "We've worked on multiple cases together." "Would you describe Richards as someone who follows protocol?" Rivera hesitated for the briefest moment, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face. "Richards has always been a capable officer," she said carefully, "but there have been instances where his judgment has been questionable." Grayson immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is speculative." Whitman turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I have evidence to support Detective Rivera's statement." The judge nodded. "Overruled." "Proceed." Whitman placed a thick file on the desk. "Detective Rivera, do you recognize this file?" Rivera nodded. "Yes. It's a collection of complaints against Officer Richards, both from civilians and within the department." Another wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Whitman flipped to a specific page. "Let's talk about one incident in particular. A civilian reported that Richards detained them during a routine traffic stop using excessive force. Can you confirm that this complaint was filed?" "Yes," Rivera said. "I was the investigator assigned to that case." "And what was the outcome?" Whitman pressed. Rivera hesitated again, then answered firmly. "The complaint was dismissed due to lack of evidence. However, I always felt the case deserved further scrutiny." Whitman nodded, letting the information sink in before continuing. "Detective Rivera, in your professional opinion, did the department fail to hold Officer Richards accountable for his actions?" "Yes," Rivera said, her voice steady. "There were multiple red flags, but they were ignored or swept under the rug. If the department had acted sooner, this incident with Layla might never have happened." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the weight of Rivera's words settling over everyone present. The judge banged her gavel for order, but the damage to Richards' defense was already done. The next witness was a forensic analyst, who presented GPS data from Richards' patrol car. The data showed the exact route he had taken that night, corroborating Layla's account of being driven to the remote clearing. Based on the GPS data, the analyst explained, there were multiple opportunities for Officer Richards to return Layla to her home. Instead, he deliberately drove to an isolated area far from her neighborhood. Whitman paced in front of the jury, her expression grim. "And in your expert opinion, would there be any legitimate reason for an officer to take such a route with a minor in their custody?" "No," the analyst said firmly. Grayson stood for cross-examination, trying to poke holes in the GPS data, but his efforts were weak. The evidence was airtight. As the prosecution rested its case, Grayson rose for his closing argument. His voice was steady, but his confidence had visibly waned. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the jury. "What happened to Layla Bennett was undeniably unfortunate. But we must remember that our legal system is built on the principle of reasonable doubt. Officer Richards has served this community for years. Is it possible that this was a series of poor decisions rather than a deliberate act of malice?" Grayson turned to Richards, gesturing toward him. "He's a man, not a monster. Let's not rush to judgment." As he sat down, Malcolm felt a surge of anger. He glanced at Layla, who sat quietly, her small hands gripping the hem of her dress. She deserved better than to have her pain downplayed as a series of poor decisions. Whitman stood for her closing argument, her presence commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice firm, "this case is not about a single mistake. It's about a pattern of behavior, a misuse of power that culminated in a terrifying ordeal for a 9-year-old girl. Layla didn't ask to be taken. She didn't provoke Officer Richards. She trusted him, just as we all trust those who wear the badge to protect us. And what did he do with that trust? He shattered it." Whitman paused, letting her words sink in. "The evidence is clear, the testimony is consistent, and the trauma Layla endured is undeniable. This isn't a case of reasonable doubt, it's a case of justice. And justice demands accountability." The jury deliberated for several hours, but it felt like days to Malcolm and Layla. They sat in a small waiting room, surrounded by family and supporters as the minutes dragged on. Malcolm held Layla's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "You've been so brave, Layla," he said softly. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." "Do you think they'll believe me?" she asked, her voice small. "They have to," Malcolm said. "The truth is on our side." Finally, the bailiff entered the room. The jury has reached a verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone filed back inside. Malcolm held Layla close as they waited for the decision. The foreman stood, holding a slip of paper in his hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Richards, guilty on all charges." The gallery erupted in cheers and applause. Malcolm pulled Layla into a tight embrace, his eyes brimming with tears. "It's over," he whispered. "You're safe now." But as the courtroom settled, Malcolm knew this was only the beginning. Richards would face justice, but the system that had enabled his actions needed to change. As they left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into chants of justice for Layla. Malcolm looked down at his daughter, who smiled faintly for the first time in days. "We did it, Daddy," she said softly. Malcolm nodded. "We did, but there's still more to do." The city was still buzzing from the verdict. The conviction of Officer Richards marked a turning point, not just for Malcolm and Layla, but for the community as a whole. Across the city, people discussed the trial with a mixture of relief, anger, and hope. Signs reading "Justice for Layla" still hung in shop windows and on lampposts, a testament to the impact of her story. Malcolm sat in his office at the precinct, his gaze fixed on a file in front of him. The document detailed reforms proposed by a newly formed oversight committee, a direct result of public pressure following Richards's arrest. Malcolm had thrown his full support behind the initiative, determined to ensure that no one else would suffer as his daughter had. Detective Rivera knocked lightly on the door before stepping inside, a stack of papers in her hands. "Captain," she said, using his new title. He'd been promoted just a week after the trial concluded, a recognition of his unwavering commitment to justice. "Here's the latest from the internal investigations team. Looks like we've uncovered more misconduct cases tied to officers who were close to Richards." Malcolm frowned as he flipped through the pages. The findings were troubling, but not surprising. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and misuse of authority littered the reports. "We can't just fire them and move on," Malcolm said, his voice heavy. "We need to rebuild this department from the ground up. Training, accountability, transparency, it all has to change." Rivera nodded. "It's not going to be easy," she said. "There are a lot of people who think these reforms are unnecessary. Some are even openly hostile about it." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his expression resolute. "Let them be," he said. "They can complain all they want, but this isn't negotiable. If they can't get on board with doing the right thing, they don't belong here." At home, Layla was slowly adjusting to a new sense of normalcy. Her nightmares had become less frequent, though they hadn't disappeared entirely. She spent her evenings drawing in her journal, a mix of simple sketches and detailed depictions of her feelings. One evening, she called her father into her room. Malcolm found her sitting cross-legged on her bed, her journal open in front of her. "Look," she said, holding up a drawing. It was a picture of a park filled with children laughing and playing. In the corner of the page, a small figure of a girl held hands with a tall man wearing a police badge. "It's us," Layla said quietly, "but in a world where everything feels safe." Malcolm's throat tightened as he sat beside her. He studied the drawing for a long moment before pulling her into a hug. "That's a beautiful world, sweetheart," he said, "and it's a world worth fighting for." Layla looked up at him, her expression serious. "Do you think we can really make it happen?" "We already are," Malcolm replied. "You're the reason people are listening. Your voice is changing things." A few weeks later, Malcolm and Layla attended a community town hall meeting. It was one of many gatherings held in the wake of the trial to address concerns about police accountability. The room was packed with residents eager to share their stories and demand change. Malcolm stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. He spoke candidly about the failures within the department and the steps being taken to address them. "We can't erase the past," he said, his voice steady. "But we can learn from it. We can make sure it never happens again. And that starts with all of us, law enforcement and the community, working together to build trust. The crowd erupted into applause. Malcolm scanned the room and saw Layla sitting in the front row, a faint smile on her face. She had insisted on attending, saying she wanted to see the change her story was helping to create. When the meeting ended, several families approached Layla to thank her for her bravery. One mother knelt down to speak to her, her voice trembling with emotion. "My son was scared of the police after what happened to him last year," she said. "But hearing your story gave him hope. You're so brave, Layla. Thank you." Layla's cheeks flushed with pride, and she looked up at her father. "I think we really are helping," she said softly. "You are," Malcolm said, his voice full of warmth. "More than you know." But not everyone embraced the changes with open arms. Within the department, Malcolm faced resistance from officers who viewed the reforms as unnecessary or even a betrayal. Anonymous threats began to appear in his office mailbox, and whispers of dissent circulated among the ranks. One evening, as Malcolm prepared to leave the precinct, Detective Rivera stopped him in the parking lot. "Captain," she said, her tone cautious, "I just wanted to say you're doing the right thing. I know it's not easy, but people are noticing. It's making a difference." Malcolm nodded, his expression tired but resolute. "Thank you, Rivera," he said. "Sometimes it feels like an uphill battle, but it's one worth fighting." As he drove home that night, Malcolm thought about Layla, the progress they had made, and the long road still ahead. He wasn't naive. He knew that change would take time and persistence, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. At home, Layla had begun writing letters to other kids who had experienced similar traumas. With her therapist's encouragement, she used her words to offer comfort and solidarity. One evening, she showed Malcolm a letter she had received from a boy named Marcus. "Dear Layla," it began. "I saw your story on the news, and it made me feel less alone. I didn't think anyone cared about kids like me, but now I think maybe things can get better. Thank you for being brave." As Malcolm read the letter, his chest swelled with pride. He looked at Layla, who was watching him anxiously. "Do you think we're really helping, Daddy?" she asked. "Yes, baby girl," Malcolm said firmly. "We're helping, and together we're going to keep helping, one step at a time." Layla nodded, a small smile spreading across her face. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt a glimmer of peace. Months had passed since the trial, and while life had not returned to what it once was, Malcolm and Layla had found a new rhythm. The scars left by Richard's actions, both physical and emotional, were still healing, but they no longer defined their days. Instead, they had become a source of strength and purpose. Bookmark go back. Layla's story had grown beyond their small city. News outlets had picked up the case, turning her into a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the importance of accountability within law enforcement. Letters from children and families across the country continued to pour in, each one sharing stories of fear, hope, and admiration for her bravery. One day, as Layla sat at the kitchen table, she wrote back to one of the letters. Her pen moved slowly across the paper, her words careful and deliberate. "Dear Marcus," she wrote, addressing the boy who had sent her the heartfelt letter weeks earlier. "Thank you for sharing your story with me. It means a lot to know that my story made you feel less alone. I hope you know you're not alone anymore. There are people who care about you, even if it doesn't always feel that way. Stay strong and keep believing in better days." When she finished, she handed the letter to Malcolm. "Do you think he'll like it?" she asked, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Malcolm smiled and nodded. "I think it's perfect," he said, "and I think it'll mean the world to him." The reforms Malcolm had championed were beginning to take shape. The precinct had implemented new training programs focusing on de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and accountability. An independent oversight committee had been established to handle complaints against officers, ensuring that incidents like Richards's wouldn't be buried or ignored. The changes weren't without resistance. Some officers had quit in protest, claiming that the new policies were too restrictive. Others remained but voiced their dissatisfaction loudly. Despite this, Malcolm stood firm, his resolve unshaken. "This isn't about making people comfortable," he told his team during a meeting. "It's about doing what's right. If that makes some of you uncomfortable, then maybe you need to take a hard look at why. His words carried weight, and while the pushback didn't entirely disappear, it began to soften. Slowly but surely, the culture within the department was shifting. Layla, too, was finding her voice. With her therapist's support, she began speaking at local events aimed at fostering trust between the police and the community. Her first public speech was at a gathering in the city park, where families and law enforcement officers came together to share their stories. Standing on a small stage, Layla clutched the microphone tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. Malcolm stood just behind her, offering silent encouragement. "When I was scared," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "my dad found me. He made me feel safe again. But not every kid has someone to find them. That's why we need to make sure the people who are supposed to protect us really do protect us." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. "I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did," Layla continued. "I want kids to feel safe, no matter what. And I think we can make that happen if we work together." The applause that followed was thunderous, and as Layla stepped off the stage, Malcolm knelt down and pulled her into a hug. "You were amazing," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you think it helped?" Layla asked. "I know it did," Malcolm said. The anniversary of the trial brought with it a mix of emotions. To mark the occasion, a community event was held at City Hall, celebrating the progress made over the past year. Layla was invited to speak again, this time alongside her father. As Malcolm addressed the crowd, his voice carried both the weight of their struggles and the hope for the future. "This isn't just about what happened to my daughter," he said. "It's about ensuring that no child, no family, ever has to endure what we did. It's about creating a system that values accountability and trust, a system that serves the people rather than itself." When it was Layla's turn to speak, she stepped forward with newfound confidence. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said simply, "because I know there are good people who want to make things better, and I want to help them. I want to help make sure every kid feels safe." As she finished, the crowd rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the square. At home that evening, Malcolm and Layla sat together on the couch, watching the news coverage of the event. Footage of their speeches played on the screen, interspersed with interviews from attendees. "Look at that," Malcolm said, nudging Layla gently. "You're a star." Layla giggled, a sound Malcolm hadn't heard in far too long. "I'm just doing what you taught me," she said. "Standing up for what's right." Malcolm smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "You're making the world a better place, Layla. Never forget that." As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Malcolm and Layla continued to heal. Their journey wasn't easy, but they faced each challenge together, drawing strength from their bond and the support of their community. For Malcolm, the fight for justice had become a lifelong mission. For Layla, it was a chance to turn her pain into purpose. Together, they were determined to ensure that their story would be a catalyst for change, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of standing up for what's right. And as Layla drifted off to sleep that night, clutching the stuffed bear her father had given her years ago, Malcolm sat beside her, silently vowing to keep his promise. He would protect her, he would fight for her, and he would never stop working to build the world she deserved. The story of Layla and Malcolm Bennett is one of resilience, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It serves as a stark reminder of the harm that can result when trust is betrayed by those in positions of power. But it also shines a light on the strength of a community united in its demand for change. Layla's bravery and Malcolm's unwavering determination not only brought justice to their family, but also sparked a movement to address the systemic issues that allowed such betrayal to occur. This story highlights the importance of accountability in law enforcement, the power of standing up for what's right, and the necessity of creating systems that prioritize safety and trust for all. It reminds us that while progress is difficult and often slow, change begins when people refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Layla's journey also teaches us that even in the darkest moments, hope and courage can prevail. Her voice, small but mighty, became the catalyst for a better future, not just for herself, but for countless others who have felt voiceless. If this story moved you, We'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. Don't stop there. Share your own experiences or reflections in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going and continue to push for the change we all want to see. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to make sure you never miss another story like this. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to light and inspire positive action. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time. Share your thoughts below and let's work toward a brighter future together.